So I guess what I've heard this morning in part was there's not a neglected middle, but I'm not so sure. So lots of roles of research. I'm not going to say anything surprising now. There's foundational research where you try to sort out who your audience is, what the issues are that you're trying to address, what their lives are like before even thinking about the structure of intervention. And then there's more formative work where you actually have specific plans and you're trying them out. And then at the bottom, there's summative research where you try to say, did it work and for whom? And we're not going to talk about any of those three. Clearly what we're talking about is this middle area, monitoring, feedback, feed forward, neglected middle, responsive feedback systems, whatever you want to call it. We had that great word cluster, kind of what the terms are for those earlier, which said all the possibilities. All right, structure of the presentation. So I'll going to begin with two historical examples where success was undermined, in my view, by a lack of effective operational research, lack of an effective responsive feedback system. Then I'll move on to talk about the components of a useful operational research or responsive feedback system, and they're all over there. But I'm going to limit it to just three ideas: the capacity to ask useful questions, the capacity to gather valid data in a timely way, and the capacity to modify program operations in response to evidence. Those are the three, in my view, the three crucial elements of an operational research system. Then what I want to do, and this is where I'll enter into a little bit newer material, is how you might approach what the interesting questions are. Really, what I'm going to talk about is the specification of an operational and conceptual model, what has been called the theory of change, but I'm using slightly different terms. And then the issue of how you decide which of those, what pieces of that model you want to address within operational research. And I'm going to argue that where you want to focus is where the risk of failure is larger, given the history of working in an area, and where there's leverage for program decisions, where something might actually change if you have the right evidence. And then I'll finally talk about an example of a tracking survey to provide rapid feedback in one particular instance. Okay, case number one, the National High Blood Pressure Education Program. This program was a substantial national multi-component program meant to transform high blood pressure control in the United States. It's been described as an all but the kitchen sink program meant to address a wide range of influences on blood pressure control, included expert consultation, which led to the redefinition of criteria for treatment, large-scale diffusion of new guidelines to and through medical organizations, public education, including through state departments of health, direct mass media advertising, and information placement with individual broadcasters. The idea of this program was to reshape the public communication environment around high blood pressure control so that individuals at risk would be repeatedly and over time exposed to information and encouragement to take action. And in fact, there was a huge decline in stroke mortality during that period. What you're looking at there is the overall tendency before 1972 when the program began of stroke rate mortality. You can see it's already declining, but then you see after the program begins between 1972 and middle 1980s, a very sharp difference. The observed straight line is what would have expected to happen, and the lower curve is what was observed. So you see this very sharp change. The evaluators show that during this period there were substantial increases in individual recognition of the term hypertension and knowledge of the risks of hypertension, and also in people's awareness of their own risk of hypertension. There was an acceleration in the number of visits to physicians for hypertension. There were decreases in salt usage, and there were increases in the proportion of the population with high blood pressure under control. Certainly all of that very positive. One of my favorite examples of effective public health communication programs. But one of the important components of the NHBPEP intervention, according to its managers, was responding to a flow of information to redirect activities. Finally, we get to the topic that we want to address here. For example, between 1972 and 1975, they found early success in increasing awareness of hypertension. It went from 50% to 64% for those of you with arithmetic problems. 64 is 100 minus 36. But less success in the transition from awareness to control, a shift from 17% to 20% of the hypertensive had their hypertension under control. This led the NHBPEP leadership to shift their priorities away from awareness and screening and towards long-term therapy, maintenance, and control of high blood pressure. This claim is important in two ways. It testifies to the importance of being open to change and the need to respond to evidence about ongoing effects. On the other hand, it suggests some concern about the slow pace of program evolution. It took them 3 years before they noticed that they weren't affecting control. And the likely value, therefore, of accelerating the collection of monitoring information more often than the 3-year gap illustrated here. So here's an immensely successful program, but could have been more successful had they had a feedback system that was telling them their problems earlier on. Case 2, Ethiopia. The Integrated Community Case Management of Childhood Illnesses project, ICCM. So the graph there is a generic graph of the change in child mortality rates over the period from 2000 to 2013. We have a huge decline. There's been extraordinary success improving child survival since 2000. And so the graph is a countrywide, worldwide graph, going from 77 per 1,000 children dying to 46. But in Ethiopia, where the rate was much higher to begin with, 205, it went down to 64 in 2013. So now we're getting to the story I actually want to tell you. Among the recommended programs for trying to reduce child mortality, what was called the Integrated Community Case Management of Childhood Illnesses Program, I will abbreviate as ICCM, which involved retraining and supervising health post workers to appropriately treat childhood illnesses. There was a recent careful evaluation of this at-scale program, this implementation of one of the recommended interventions. The cluster randomized evaluation found that geographic areas which received this intervention made progress in treatment demand and in mortality, but only at the same rate as did areas which operated under the conventional system. Both cases declines of about 5 per 1,000 in a 2 to 550 in 2 to 59-month mortality. The evaluators concluded that the failure of the program was in its inability to stimulate demand. Parents were not bringing their children at risk into the health posts, and the program only improved supply quality, that is what the health post workers were doing, and did not address demand. But here's the thing. The program developers knew this from the start. They did baseline surveys. They found only 4% of the population was coming in to the health posts. And then they did some evaluation about 6 months in. And they found it was still true. People were not bringing their kids in. This was an RCT, a fixed program. They continued to evaluate it as it sat. I don't know whether this reflected the slowness of processing the midterm evidence, or perhaps it reflected the commitment to undertaking a clean evaluation of the originally proposed interventions as if it were a vaccine. So 2 cases. The NHBPEP, responsive to evidence, but evidence gathered on a slow cycle, delayed redirection. ICCM in Ethiopia had evidence available, but did not redirect its operating model. These examples underpin the next section of the talk, capacities that should be part of a monitoring system meant to help projects work. So, what are the components of an effective responsive feedback system? Again, nothing that you haven't heard already this morning. The ability to collect decision-relevant data systematically on a short cycle. To be honest, that's what we generally think about most of the time, although not this morning. But that's an important issue to discuss, how to collect that data efficiently. But I want to argue, and again, not inconsistently with our previous discussion, that the capacity for systematic and timely data collection must be complemented with these two other capacities. The capacity to decide what needs to be assessed as it evolves over time, and the capacity to respond to collected data, to make new decisions contingent on what the evidence says. All right, so now I get to the more interesting part of the talk. What questions can a responsive feedback system address? So I want to decide what I'm calling here a construction of a conceptual logistic model is, of course, just the same as a theory of change. You know, it's almost the same as a theory of change. But I want to say a theory of change that is a theory of how a model is operating is too complex to be able to address everything that's in it for any sort of responsive feedback system. So the question is, what do you address? What do you look at? How do you decide what deserves your attention? I want to argue you want to focus on what you think are crucial links and what you think are weak links, or potentially weak links. I also want to talk about the distinction between a monitoring, what I think Sarah called pointers this morning, but basically where you're trying to see whether things are changing in the right direction, versus causal claims, knowing that you were responsible for or your intervention was responsible for the change. And of course, you need to think about what can be afforded, both on a continuing basis and then on a one-off basis to examine a particular question. All right, so here's the complex piece. Wait, can we get there a second? There we go. Can you all see that, more or less? All right, just read, no. So some years ago, the US government spent about $1 billion trying to keep kids from using drugs. And collaborating with a group at Westat, we did the evaluation of that program, trying to sort out whether it worked or not. I won't talk in much detail about the overall evaluation. But part of that required us to create a model of how the thing was supposed to work. How was it supposed to influence behavior? And here, is there actually you over there, imagine you're following me before I fall off the thing. This part of it, up to the point which is exposure to campaign messages, is essentially the operational model. It's the part which describes what they were going to do and what behaviors, what the program was supposed to, how it was supposed to operate. The stuff on the other side is the conceptual model. That is how the program was supposed to affect behavior. So all the way at the end, you have drug use. This was designed for 11 to 18-year-olds. Mostly the drugs they were concerned with at that point was marijuana. They were interested in other drugs as well, but the only one that happened at a large enough scale to actually measure was marijuana, so that was the one that got focused on. Having a model like this, and so this is, I think, the crucial statement, and it's consistent with where the conversation was going this morning. Having a model like this allows you to think about what should be happening in the program. What should happen when? So on the left-hand side, NYAMC stands for National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign. They were doing a bunch of stuff, and two of the things they wanted to see happen was on the upper side, community organization of anti-drug activity. They wanted to see the Boy Scouts and women's clubs and schools doing anti-drug stuff. And they essentially hired a public relations firm to do that. And separately, they were going to put a lot of ads on television, which they did. 2.5, the average kid saw 2.5 ads a week over several years. So we're talking about a lot of presence. Their model of the way kids were going to be exposed to messages included direct exposure to anti-drug messages, friends talking about drugs, friends' transmission of anti-drug messages to producing exposure, parents being reached, because they also were directly exposed. There was a separate parents campaign, which was supposed to lead them to talk to their kids about drugs, which is also supposed to affect the transmission of messages. And finally, other institutions, the Boy Scouts and schools are supposed to transmit other messages as well. Then we get, all that focuses on exposure to campaign messages, and that then produces, supposedly, and those of you who know health behavior theory well will recognize this as essentially the reasoned action model, the Fishbein and Eisen's model, borrowing a bit from Bandura and producing an effects model, which says there's going to be knowledge and belief changes about the consequences of drug use, upper left-hand side, up there, which is going to change overall attitude. It's going to change self-efficacy, that is the kid's belief they can actually avoid using drugs, and perception of specific others' use of drugs, and their expectations that this kid would use drugs, which would lead to what's called the overall perceived expectations of norms. All those things lead to intentions not to use, and then to not actual behavior. Now, it recognizes, I won't go over all this stuff, there's lots of other stuff happening in the environment. That's all down here. And there's external constraints on kids' use, which I won't go after right now. And this was the model we used for designing the overall evaluation. But you see, it also is perfectly relevant for a responsive feedback system, because it says certain things are supposed to happen. Kids are supposed to see the ads. Well, we measured that, and they did. Communities are supposed to have a lot more activity. We measured that, and they didn't. There's essentially nothing changing as far as the communities were going on. Parents were supposed to transmit anti-drug messages. Well, actually, when we measured that, we didn't see much evidence for it. The parents were affected themselves. They believed in stuff, but they didn't actually talk to their kids anymore than it did before. And as some of you know, the overall evaluation said the more kids were exposed to the media campaign, the more interested they were in drugs. That's a long story. That's the summative evaluation story. All right. But you see, there are two things to think about here with regard to responsive feedback systems. One is by laying out the theory of the program. It's not just a theory of change, because it's a theory. It's an operational model as well as a conceptual model of how the thing is supposed to work. It tells you, here's the crucial things you're arguing for. Well, nothing in a media campaign is as important as expecting there'll be exposure to messages, because I looked at a lot of campaigns in my life, and the biggest failure of those campaigns is they never reach their audiences. That's a very typical problem. So as an evaluator, the first place I'm going to look is, are they getting any exposure? An important statement, not merely because I'm bragging. No, it's important because what it tells you is people with a technical evaluation knowledge won't ever do the right evaluation. What you have to understand is the intervention that you're looking at and how it's constructed and what the theory is around that sort of intervention to know where to look. Because you can be technically correct, you know a lot about evaluation, you're never going to figure out that I'm going to put my money here and figure out whether this worked rather than here. Okay. Second example. This was a Philadelphia campaign. The city of Philadelphia, with money from the Centers for Disease Control, said, we want to encourage people to quit smoking with help. Their goal was not getting people to quit smoking. People were trying to quit all the time. They mostly failed. And they said, the literature says that if they quit with help, of some sort of help, they're more likely to quit successfully. And so that was their goal. And I'm not going to go over this whole campaign, but I want to focus on one part of it. But before I get there, let me tell you the rest of the campaign. It'll look a lot like the last one. So their goal was they were going to buy a bunch of ad time. They had both television ads and radio ads and transit ads, which means they wrapped buses. And they had convenience store ads. They put up signs in convenience stores. And they thought that would lead to exposure to their ads. And that would then lead to some near-term outcomes, that people would seek more information themselves about the consequences. They'd talk about the ad with others. They'd talk about quitting and so on. They'd have more knowledge. They'd have the right beliefs. They'd feel more self-efficacious. You see the reason to action theory back again. And that would in turn affect their intentions to use help and to seek medical assistance and so on. And that would then lead to the actual behaviors of quitting attempts using help. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at those outcomes right now, because I want to show you something else. So let me focus at just the first part of that model, ad exposure, or ad activity leading to ad exposure. So they did three, they did more, but I'm going to focus on these three types of ads. They did television advertising, they did radio ads, and they did transit ads, these riding the bus. And also, for subways, they put placards up. Their assumption was that if they bought a bunch of media television time, they bought a bunch of radio time, and they bought a bunch of transit ad space, that people would actually notice the ads. Seems like a pretty reasonable assumption. And it was sort of true. Oh, let me go back. Yeah. So we collected data every month, fresh sample, a random digit dial telephone survey in Philadelphia of 200 adult smokers. Do you think I'm going to joke to that? Okay. Thank you, I appreciate that. We did it before the campaign started and then for the 16 months of the actual campaign. The survey actually was used both for monitoring and also for the summative evaluation, which I won't talk about so much. And they also had data about how much media time they bought, what are called targeted rating points. That is, so the next graphs I'm going to show you deal with the evidence about recall given how much media time they were buying. And you can see these are really examples of what you could do with a responsive feedback system. So this first one is for TV ads. And so the first thing to notice, the yellow line is the percent of the population who recalled seeing the ad at all in the last 30 days. The blue lines, the blue columns are the number of targeted rating points they bought, where 100 targeted rating points means the average person should see the ad once in a given period. And so the first thing that's striking here is this matches the axis over there. The yellow line matches the axis on the right. And what you see is about 15 to 20% of the population was already claiming to have heard the ad before it was on the air. So when you're doing this stuff, measure beforehand, because people tend to want to be nice to you. And they tell you, yes, we've seen it. And they might be missing. It's not that they're lying. It's just that all ad sort of descriptions sound the same. And so it's possible that they're going to say yes, they do. But you see, once they start buying media time, these blue lines, then the percentage who recall it goes up pretty sharply, and it moves all the way up by month 4 into almost 50% of the population saying that. And it pretty much stays up the entire time. It doesn't get boosted a lot by later broadcasts, but it stays there at a reasonable level. Let me contrast that. This is the, oh, I thought let me contrast it. Let me contrast it. Oh, there we go. No, here's the radio ad. And again, almost 20% before it's on the air are saying that they heard it. And it goes up some to a little over 40% by the second month. And it sort of stays there, though it's beginning to decline later on. So it's not as effective as the television ad, also costs less than television ad. It gets some broadcast, some recall. Third. Then there's the transit ad. It starts out at 20%, doesn't go up, goes up a little, it goes back down, goes up right when there's no broadcast on, no actual place. Here's where we said, don't do it. It's not getting nobody's noticing it. Yeah?
Sorry, I was just wondering, after seeing slide after slide of the exposure measures being detected before the campaign is actually broadcast, I have to wonder what the series of questions look like and how specific were the questions about the radio and television ad.
So for the radio, let me give you, I have the radio one here. Have you heard a radio ad in which a teenager encourages his mother to stop smoking like she promised she would? So the radio ad is very specific. So it's not, did you hear a radio ad about smoking? It's about that particular story. And each of the ad questions were that level specific to the ad itself.
And are there previous questions that might prime them to respond positively?
It's possible. We were already asked about whether they're smokers or not, whether they quit smoking. We asked the behavior questions before we get to the exposure questions. So all of those might have produced that baseline level. So what we're interested in here is the change, right? Is how much it went up after the ad started. Because we weren't willing to claim that there was real exposure if we don't get any increase in percentage saying they were exposed after the ads actually went on the air. And we do get it, of course, from television. And actually there's another television ad, which I'm not showing you, where they got to 70 or 80% saying they'd seen it. We weren't doing great on exposure.
Sorry, yeah?
I'm sorry?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm trying to understand this data, so it's probably just understanding. So in between is the number of months, right? So are we saying that there was something that peaked in the 7th month in terms of the recall?
Yeah, I think it's, if I put confidence limits or confidence intervals around them,
it would be not significant.
It would probably be not very different.
Okay.
We're talking about 200 people a month.
Oh.
So actually in those middle months it was smaller than that.
So the recall is much lower than, I mean, and you're doing this instantly and yet the recall is very low,
Well,
right?
every month. Sorry?
And are they asked every month if you've seen it that month?
Yes, it's asked in the past 30 days. That doesn't mean people are being disciplined about that and they only think about the past 30 days, but every month the questions are the same. It's a new sample. It's not the same people. It's a fresh sample every month. It's telephone surveys with all the strengths and weaknesses of that, but basically, the point I want to make here, obviously, is that if you have running a responsive feedback system and you're 4 months in, you're seeing that these transit ads are getting no attention whatsoever, on average people are just not recalling them, you probably want to take the money away from them and put it someplace else. Now, despite the fact we were actually reporting to them every 2 months, I can't remember now, either a month or 2 months, telling them what had happened, they didn't actually necessarily change. They stopped and then they went back to it for reasons I can't recall anymore. Yeah.
Was there any diagnosis done on why this trend was being observed?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Was there any diagnosis done on why this trend was being observed?
I think transit ads just don't get very many people.
By design, it's transit, so.
Everybody doesn't use the buses or other subways. Some people, the population, all the smokers don't. They may not notice them because it's a lot of clutter that's there. So all those are explanations. They wouldn't have wrapped every bus in the city, but a few buses. For whatever reason, it's not trivial cost, but they just don't get much attention. Okay. I'm going the wrong one. Why am I? Oh yeah, okay, good. So maybe it won't shock you, But at a population level, we don't see any evidence of any change in the proportion of people who used help in the previous month or 3 months. We ask both ways. Now, I will be honest, and not be honest, but not being honest, but that was a throwaway line, just forget it. The real problem here is we don't have enough sample to get in order to be able to see change here, we would have needed to get to about 16 or 17% for the last month, and we're really around 12, 13% to be able to see significant change. The error is just too large to be able to really capture what we wanted to capture. But there's no tendency here for it to go up. I will say separate analyses that I'm not showing you suggested those people who were exposed to these ads, particularly the television ad, were in fact more likely to use help. So at an individual difference level, there was an evidence of effect, but at a population level, there wasn't. And we think that's largely because there just wasn't enough exposure to the ads. Okay, let me close down now and be open to questions. Okay. I really only have 3 points to make. Arguing, in fact, that responsive feedback systems, getting data on a reasonably quick schedule, should be a complement to formative and summative research, not a shock for anybody here. Again, a point that was made repeatedly this morning, responsive feedback systems, however you want to label them, are not merely about data collection, but about knowing what questions are worth addressing and how to incorporate results into program decisions. Here's something I suggested but didn't elaborate much. The likely value of specifying a program conceptual and logistical models. I did elaborate that argument, which says, not differently than the idea of theory of change, but maybe a more elaborate version of that, really specifying how the thing is supposed to work. And then trying to decide that there are lots of arrows and lots of places you can monitor. You have to decide where to put your resources. Which of the questions should you go after? Which things should you monitor? Which causal questions should you invest in? And I'm arguing there are 2 places to think about that. One is, what's crucial for your model, operational model? So, as I say, for communication campaigns, that's what I bring to the table. It's often the issue of exposure. Trying to make sure exposure actually happens. But also, so what's crucial, but also where you're worried about things. You have limited resources. Where are you going to put it? So in some ways, the most important question here for that first piece is deciding what the model is and then where you're going to use your responsive feedback system. You know, we talk in some ways generic way. The responsive feedback systems are good. The question is, there's a million questions you could ask. How are you going to decide which ones to ask, which ones to put investment in? And then, of course, the crucial thing is being ready to respond. And so one of the things we were talking about that in our group this morning is being able to say, a priori, if the data looks like this, I'm going to go in this direction. If it looks like that, I'm going to go in that direction, before you get the data. So in the case of the transit ads, saying, if I don't find any evidence that they are getting much exposure, I'm going to stop putting money into transit ads. I'm going to put it someplace else. And then, of course, there's a chance to talk about the technology of RFS data collection, something I've really not done very much. I used one example of monthly surveys. I like that example, but there are many other ways to do it, depending on the context, and I won't try to argue for that as better than others. I will say this. People were distinguishing between monitoring and evaluation systems, and that's legitimate, but it's often the case that you can use data gathered for monitoring for evaluation purposes. It's not as if they're mutually, the sort of data you gathered couldn't be used for both purposes. I think that's often the case, and as it was in the case of the Philadelphia using help campaign. I'm done.